Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture today on state responsibility in cybersecurity. My name is Leonard, and I will briefly guide you through our lecture today. Before we start the lecture, just some brief organizational topics. You will all know this by now, I guess, but just to be clear, so we will have a presentation for 50 minutes. And then afterwards, you will have 10 minutes for your Q&A session or Q&A questions. I would like to ask you, please, once you have a question, to put or to write it into the Q&A link that you find next to the chat function. So please put it into the Q&A, because if you put it into the chat, like sometimes we have like some technical issues and we cannot see all the questions. So just put that into the Q&A once you have a question, and I will gather them and then ask them after the end of our lecture, but please no spam here. Exactly. We will be joined today by Modjehi Makumane. Modjehi is a researcher with the Security and Technology Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Her expertise spans the international cybersecurity domain, with emphasis on the implications of emerging technologies for the security in developing countries. Before her current work, she was working at the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And with that being said, without further ado, the floor is yours, Modjehi.
Thank you so much, Leonard, and thank you for inviting me, and good day to everyone who's joining us on this call. As Leonard has said, my name is Modjehi Makumane, and I will be taking you through today's presentation on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And now I will be sharing my slides, and then we will get started. Share. Everything looking good?
All good, thank
you. Thank you. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so what is today's goal? So today's goal is to inform you on how the framework for responsible state behavior is adapting to the cybersecurity landscape, and I'll be doing this by using scenarios. So what is the framework for responsible state behavior? So I will do this by talking through a couple of points. So as we know, malicious cyber incidents can be perpetrated against state or non-state actors. And by non-state, I'm talking about your private organizations, as well as other non-state entities. But then they can also be perpetrated against states. And these are usually the cyber incidents. And I'll use cyber incidents because we don't really use the word attack at UNIDIR, but it means the same thing. The cyber incidents that make it in the headlines against states are usually the ones that really capture the public's imagination. But then at the same time, you also have perpetrators that are state and non-state. And when a non-state entity is behind a malicious incident, you have law enforcement that then uses cybercrime legislation or related legislation to deal with that actor. But what happens when you find that the attack has been perpetrated by a state actor? That brings us into what we will be talking about today, where there is an incident by a state or towards a state, and what kind of thinking the United Nations has done over the past 25 years to understand how then to manage that particular area. So in 1998, the first resolution was passed by the United Nations, and this resolution basically acknowledged that there were developments in technology that could pose a risk to international peace and security. And so states then decided to look into what technological advancements could have this kind of impact. But then they also realized that in assessing this, it was important that states not stifle innovation or put unnecessary regulation or prohibitions on existing technologies or ones that were yet to be developed. And so instead, states then agreed that the technology itself wasn't the problem, but rather how states were using it. And so they wanted to develop a framework that then would give states an opportunity to have access to the technology, but then to use it in a responsible manner. And we'll go through what responsible technology use means as states discuss it. But it's basically that states would use that technology taking into account the international agreements they have signed up to, the bilateral agreements, trilateral agreements that they have signed up to, but also their national policies, including towards gender mainstreaming, or even how they interact with non-state stakeholders like academia, civil society. And so the decision then was that we would focus on responsible state behavior instead of trying to regulate or prohibit use of certain technologies. But this is a very difficult bag to deal with because diplomatic relations between states are not just about one thing. They are about multiple things that coexist in that ecosystem. And so it was also important that discussions around developments in ICT also take into consideration the other aspects of international peace and security, but also the third pillar of the United Nations, which is human rights. And so in that bag, then the states decided that while discussing ICT use, is a technological issue, it would have impact on peace and security, but also human rights, and even more lately, even on humanitarian issues. And the important thing was also international peace and security here. So states were concerned with incidents that were not limited to domestic jurisdictions. And so incidents that would then impact at least two or more states and could potentially risk destabilizing the security of other regions and other states that were far away from the origin of the incident itself, but would be impacted because of those cascading and cross-border impacts that a cyber incident can have. The technology part. The technology part has been one of the bigger challenges in states discussing responsible behavior, because since 1998 to today, there have been so many improvements, so many new technologies. And so now the questions are, have the systems that we have built adaptable enough to new technologies? And you will see by the scenarios that I will use that we will look through some of the newer ways in which the technologies are developing, but also how the vectors are being handled by states, where old technologies are when meeting with new developments can cause vectors that increase the frequency and sophistication of those cyber incidents. The big challenge when talking about state responsibility is that the actors that are involved in developing malicious incidents have a wide variety of technologies that they can choose from, as well as easy access. And so there are instances where technology or advancements that were previously only owned by states are now easily accessible. And there we will talk about the challenge that we are currently experiencing of commercially available cyber intrusion tools or just off-the-shelf type of tools that are now presenting a bigger challenge for states, because then anyone can perpetrate these kinds of incidents. But cyberspace, as far as the UN and UN member states are concerned, is not the Wild West. Even though it may look like there isn't a lot of regulation or prohibition on what states can do, or on what non-state actors can do towards states, or vice versa, it is not a Wild West. And as the UN, we believe that states have developed a framework that sufficiently covers the issues that they've got. And I've already addressed the issue of the low barriers to entry that non-state actors now have in being able to also carry out malicious incidents against states, and also because it's become increasingly inexpensive to access these tools. There's a bigger problem than we had in the past. So this is our first scenario. So scenario one, we're going to be looking at a malicious incident that targets critical infrastructure. And here we're particularly looking at AI-created malware. So the target here is a nation's energy grid. And what happened was an adversarial group, a non-state actor, aimed to disrupt the national energy grid by introducing an AI-powered malware into the system. Now, this malware is designed to analyze the target infrastructure's vulnerabilities, adapt its behavior to evade detection and traditional security. And the AI-powered malware is harder to detect, as it is also capable of exploiting vulnerabilities that are still unknown without human intervention. So you've probably already gone through some of the discussions around what the cybersecurity challenges are with emerging tech like AI. And so this is just one of the ways in which we've seen non-state actors start to use AI to develop this kind of malware. But then the minute it is against an energy grid, then that is critical infrastructure of a country. And so what can that country do, and what have states agreed on doing? So the consequences there, yes, are disruption of the energy grid, but there's also economic loss and societal breakdown. So it's not just one thing. And the challenge with this is that, yes, it's targeting critical infrastructure, but the malware is also adapting and improving so quickly. So in anticipation of these kinds of challenges, states have basically then said, okay, we will then have norms of responsible state behavior, and there are 11 in total. And these are some of the norms that, in the case of a malicious attack against critical infrastructure, states are then reminded of. And some of them are what we call norms that require states to do something, and then others are norms that we say states are then encouraged to not participate in that kind of activity. So let's take it that this non-state actor was acting on behalf of another state. So here, to the victim state, we would then remind that state to say states should take appropriate measures to protect their critical infrastructure from ICT threats, taking into account General Assembly Resolution 58/199. So what this norm basically has said is that states have to take the appropriate measures. What are some of these appropriate measures? Designating critical infrastructure, as well as developing their national cybersecurity strategies, where the critical infrastructure is then put, but also to allocate necessary resources for this. And that also takes into account the ongoing assessments of the risks and threats against the critical infrastructure. And so what we found is that some states have designated their critical infrastructure as sectors. Some have designated it in terms of services, but regardless of how a state designates, in adherence with this norm, we expect that a state would at least have taken that measure to mitigate and sometimes try to prevent incidents such as these. And so the second norm that we've also developed with states is that states should not knowingly allow their territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts. And so this one would fall to the state that the state from which the incident, the malicious incident was carried out, which is basically where the adversarial actor is. So states have the ability to then pass legislation that then would criminalize such activities. And so states are then encouraged to continuously then make sure that the laws are up to date so that when adversarial actors like these, whether they are non-state actors, are carrying out these incidents, should the victim state ask for help, then the state from where the incident was carried out would be able to then, through the law enforcement, deal with the actor that is responsible for that incident. And then norm 13D is states should consider how best to cooperate to exchange information and assist each other in the prosecution of terrorist and criminal use of ICTs. And here then is the relationship again between states. There'll be a victim state and then there'll be a state from which the incident was carried out. Should the victim state that is experiencing the malicious incident against its energy grid ask for help from another state, then there should be protocols or strategies in place for them to be able to exchange that information. You might find that the victim state prefers to prosecute that non-state actor itself. And so there would need to be extradition and other exchange under mutual legal assistance frameworks. Or there might be a case that the state in which the adversarial group was operating will then prosecute. Then at the same time, all the evidence, including the information on the impact on the incident, would then be in the victim state. And so the regulations and strategies that facilitate that exchange of information are what this norm encourages states to already have in place so that it's not done when the incident happens. And then norm 13I is that states should take reasonable steps to ensure the integrity of supply chain so that end users have confidence in the security of ICT products. And we see this more and more in recent days, that the issue is also that the supply chains are being manipulated. And sometimes it's through updating of the software that then the malware is injected. And it's those kinds of things that then states are encouraged to also pay attention to, including by then developing vendor management systems, but also within the designated critical infrastructure, having standards for what kind of products are going to have. And I think what states usually like to repeat is the secure by design type of products and engaging those kinds of vendors. And so it's not only left to the private entities, but states have also agreed that this is a responsibility that they also can take on. And then norm 13J, our states should encourage responsible reporting of ICT vulnerabilities. So you remember from the incident, there was an issue that the malware is also adapting to vulnerabilities that have not been found. Sometimes organizations and state entities identify vulnerabilities, but then do not have a way of reporting. And so here again, to make sure that vulnerabilities do not fall into the wrong hands and propagated for use that was outside of what the state was hoping to use that vulnerability for, that states should have responsible vulnerabilities reporting mechanisms. And so that was just on scenario one. And so you can see then that even though the incident is against critical infrastructure, there are also ways in which we can say, did state A do certain things to protect itself? Did state B, as the country from which the incident was originating, take the necessary steps? All these are norms that states have agreed to, and so there is a reasonable expectation that this is a standard that they will pursue. And now we go to scenario 2. Scenario 2 is a social order one, and again, using AI. This one is an example of AI systems being tricked to behave differently than originally. So the target here is an AI system which evaluates immigration requests without prejudice. What happened here? Now, this one is 2 states. So this one will be very interesting for us. So what happened here is nation A aims to destabilize nation B by probing the AI system and learning its general parameters, with the goal to increase the immigration of people with criminal or terrorist background. So this is manipulation that nation A has done. The goals that nation A is trying to achieve could be multiple. It could be revenge for nation B not supporting it on a particular issue. It could be a way to coerce or encourage nation B to take a particular stance. But either way, it has manipulated an immigration system, which we understand to be an important public service that a government has. And the challenge here, or rather, let me start with the consequence. The consequence here was that there was a slow but steady rise of crime. There was a burden on the social system, but also resentment and fear among the population. And there was an urge for unbiased assessments leading to new attacks surface. The challenge here is that it destabilizes public safety within the country, but then we also have the question of, were the AI tools secure enough? So was the cybersecurity for the AI enough? Now, even though these norms were created to be broadly applicable to all types of tech, some of the challenges that we have found is that states have said they don't really understand then how this would apply to technology such as AI, or what cybersecurity for AI really means. And so what we've then done is, again, while we understand that the manipulation of systems is difficult, it can also be prevented by securing the whole AI life cycle, starting from development, deployment, and usage. And so we've gone then back to the norms to say there are applicable norms even to this kind of incident. And the first one would be targeted at nation B, which is that nation B, according to norm 13A, has acted inconsistently with the purposes of the UN, including to maintain international peace and security, because states are encouraged to cooperate in developing and applying measures to increase stability and to prevent ICT practices that are acknowledged to be harmful or that may pose threat to international peace and security. And clearly nation B has not acted in accordance with this. And so then the reminder then is that this norm exists for specifically these kinds of incidents. And so there is a reasonable expectation that nation B should have upheld this standard. And then the next one is norm 13B, which is in case of ICT incidents. Now, nation B would have all sorts of reasons to think that the adversarial state meant harm, but there could also be other explanations for that. And so before nation B starts calling out Nation A for this incident, we also have a norm that asks that the states should consider all relevant information, including the larger context of the event, the challenges of attribution in the ICT environment, and the nature and extent of the consequences. So we already know the consequences of the white boxing as well as the manipulation of that AI is that there was a bigger burden on the systems, and that there was an influx then of people which the immigration system would have deemed as undesirable, but because of that manipulation, were able to get past the regulations set by that country. We also understand the nature of how this happened. But as you may already know now, there are big challenges of attribution in the ICT environment just because of the nature. And it gets even trickier when trying to understand if a state was responsible for that attack, because a state may have been used as a proxy. But then sometimes the state is not even aware. And so they would only learn of their involvement in this incident when they are informed by the victim state. But there are also instances where a non-state actor was acting on behalf of the state. And so that creates a bit of distance. But then to prove that the non-state actor was acting on instruction of the state, thereby attributing that incident to the state, can be very difficult and very politically sensitive. And so this norm then again encourages states that they just don't take the information as it comes, but also consider it against other things, including the importance of maintaining good international relations as well as international peace and security. Norm 13F is about the state's responsibility to not support ICT activity contrary to its obligations. So in this case, what we know is that Nation A may be responsible, and then this norm would then be used to remind the Nation A that it has acted contrary to its obligations under international law. And that there could be consequences, including that the attack could have damaged the critical infrastructure or impaired the use of the infrastructure in Nation B that provides public services. And again, immigration is one of those services. But then again, we then go back to Nation B with Norm 13G to remind them that they should have taken appropriate measures to protect their critical infrastructure, including services such as immigration. And then again, we go back to the supply chain issue, because this is also how was the AI secured from design to deployment and use. So this is another way in which states are experiencing their challenges and how the UN norms for responsible state behavior are then being brought in. And then we've got our third scenario, which is political manipulation. And this one is an example of AI-powered mass disinformation skewing election preferences in a particular direction. Here, the target is the population, yes, because they are the ones who go to the polls, but also the politicians by then using the disinformation campaign. So what happened here? Now we see another layer of how the different technologies can destabilize. So here, a coordinated campaign of deepfake videos accompanied by supporting other deepfake media published during election period. And it showed one politician standing for election taking unpopular positions, retracting on former positions, stuttering with confusion, or answering questions incorrectly. Now, the consequence for the population is loss in reputation of the victim candidate, leading to the loss of election and a deeply divided nation. And the challenges here is reputation is hard to restore, but then there's also fake news and propaganda. and loss of trust in government. Now, states have also agreed that incidents that that have an impact on democratic processes, they consider to be malicious incidents that then have to be addressed under these norms of responsible state behavior, because then other states may be behind those kinds of campaigns, and that manipulating or getting involved in the domestic affairs of a state should be considered to be off bounds. But then sometimes these incidents do occur, and then we've got these kinds of incidents. And this one, I think the most important norm that comes out, while others are also applicable, is that when states do this, they are acting in contrary to the purposes of the UN and increasing stability in cyberspace, as well as preventing ICT practices that are acknowledged to be harmful or that may pose threats to international peace and security. So what these three incidents then I wanted to demonstrate for you was that even as member states may discuss these norms of responsible state behavior, there are real life practices where states have applied these norms. And there are challenges, yes, but the norms exist, and they exist to help states manage the ICT environment in an area where they cannot lean on certain things like law enforcement, but rather than have to defer to international law. Now, the framework of responsible state behavior has several pillars, and one of those pillars is international law. Now, I've spoken a bit about international law, but what states have basically agreed to is that international law is applicable in cyberspace. They do not need there to be a specific reference to ICTs, but that as it currently exists, including the UN Charter, it applies in cyberspace. Now, what is left for states to do, and some states are already doing that, is then to explain how international law applies. And so states are then issuing national positions on international law, on what sovereignty means in cyberspace, what state responsibility means in cyberspace, what due diligence means in cyberspace, and then offering their own interpretations. And on that one, there is no one size fits all, there is no agreement, but states then have an opportunity to share their positions. And then the other element that is also important in understanding how states are discussing ICTs is also the importance of capacity building. Not all states are starting rather from the same position in terms of ICTs. And that is both having access to ICTs, using ICTs. And so they have then agreed that there is an important capacity building component that also has to be part of these interactions. And so that then speaks to the broader issue, including on what happens when a state is going through a malicious ICT incident, but does not have the capabilities to address it. Can they ask for help? Yes. Are they limited in terms of who they ask for help from? They can ask for help from states, but they can also ask for help from private organizations that are willing to help them, of course, taking into account what the conditions of the state would be. And then this also goes to developing their workforce, as well as setting up institutions such as the national certs and the national C-certs, as well as the public-private partnerships. And so this is also a very important component of understanding the framework for responsible state behavior. But then as we've gone through these scenarios, we've touched a bit on threats. And since the UN has been discussing these issues, the way in which states have seen the threat landscape evolve has also evolved. And so it has evolved from states being particularly more concerned with the use of ICTs by criminal and terrorist groups to now, as early as July 2025, to states acknowledging the challenge of emerging technologies, including AI and post-quantum encryption, as some of the challenges that they are really grappling with in maintaining the ICTs and in implementing that cybersecurity. And so the threats will continue to evolve. They're not limited, but then states are also then saying that the norms that they currently have, they feel are sufficiently suitable. And then the last thing then, after going through the scenarios and seeing how states are doing this, is that they have also agreed that it's very important then for them to develop their national cybersecurity strategies to address the different elements, and that a good strategy would have elements including capacity building, focal points, and international engagement. And then with that, I will then take questions and hear what we've got. Thank you very much.
Okay, Makini, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I'll just quickly scan. So whoever has a question, they can just put it into the chat function. Not the Q&A, sorry, that was my mistake. So the chat function, whenever someone is there, I'll briefly have a look there. Okay, then I have a question. Actually, you briefly talked about the challenge for well, the challenge of certain countries to build their own capacity in responding to cyber threats. Can you speak about a bit of like the challenges that smaller countries face? Will they ever be able to actually respond to such threats, or will they always lag one step behind? Because I guess also that the threat landscape is going to change and evolve, right?
Yeah, definitely. So what we found is smaller developing countries are the ones that have really shared their concerns around the ability to respond to these threats, but also to prevent these threats. And the main things that they've said are capacities that they wish they had. One is the technology that is advancing for them to be able to detect threats, as well as to be able to then segregate within the critical infrastructure technologies that they wish they had access to, and for a lot of them they don't, and so they are relying on their workforce, which unfortunately then again becomes a cascading issue, that because there are so many threats, the existing workforce, as small as it is then overstretched. And so they then have to then go to the next step of developing workforce for them to be able to then be able to manage and to deal with those threats. But then what then we have found is that there are also a lot of states that, based on experiences, are also willing to share their capacity building, as well as to do peer-to-peer learning with interested states. And so we found that works. But what we also have done is we are working with an organization, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which has the CIBIL portal, which shows capacity building available on cybersecurity. And we also have a link on our own cyber policy portal to then help states access capacity building, or at least see what is available in order to be able to engage. But then the other one is also developed countries are also having similar challenges of capacity building, because again, it is evolving so quickly. When you think you've dealt with something, something else comes up. And that's why then within the context of these UN discussions, capacity building is a cross-cutting issue where every state say they've got their challenges. They may not be the same, but they all have challenges there.
Okay, thank you for that. One question that I have from one of our students, since both of them are from India, there's a question of whether you are aware of a norms list, so to speak, like as a study resource that lists some of those norms that states should follow in cyberspace. Yeah, and whether you can generally share like some insights on that.
Okay, so what I will do is I can share the resolution that has all the norms, including the edit guidance text, that then explains what the expectations are on the states under each norm. So you will find that under the norm, for instance, on supply chain, the resolution will then have very detailed guidance on what expectations are on the state, including the around setting up vendor management systems, or that states should then have preference for working with vendors that have secure by design, as well as responsibilities on the state, again, on how to handle government ICT tools, especially as they decommission them, so that even those tools don't fall into the wrong hands, and then sort of close that supply chain loop. I will share that resolution. I think is the most comprehensive that we've got, and then our UNIDIR publications also include detailed focus into specific norms if they have specific norms that they would like to have more detailed focus on.
Okay, and I think like I forgot like the second part. Like one other question is like, does that cost something?
No,
like, really? Okay.
No. These are free resources that they can access at any time.
Okay. Then another question is how UNIDIR handles physical security or psychological subversion related to ICT incidents. So
there isn't a specific way in which UNIDIR does this, because our primary role is to support states as they consider these topics. What we do is we provide technical support through the research that we do on these topics. But what I can say is that within the context of the UN negotiations on ICT security, the issues that are around physical security have been discussed, and that is part of discussions around critical infrastructure, but also critical information infrastructure and how that is protected. And then issues around the psychological, that is not the language that has been used thus far in the negotiations, but then they are ongoing, and so we'll see how even that develops. I can even say, for instance, even on issues related to disinformation or deep fakes, the language that states have preferred to use is incidents that interfere on the internal affairs of a state. And so there is certain language that states prefer to use, and some or all of the other aspects may fall under that, but it's really up to them to then bring forward what they think are developments that are worrying.
Okay, thank you. Another question that I've personally received is that I think we briefly touched upon that during the presentation. That's the question of attribution as well. And the question is more generally that can you know from experience, or is it likely that if a state attributes a cyber attack to another state, that this could lead to some sort of an escalation? So either like physically or even more more cyber attacks as a sort of retribution for calling out the state?
The cyber attribution in the context of this is meant as a deterrence, and was thought of as a way to dissuade states from then carrying out malicious incidents. And what the negotiations have come up is that there are 3 levels of attribution. And so we've got the technical attribution, which is the information that then the state would get from their CSIRTs. And that is just on the technical stuff, the techniques and the different procedures, then the technical part. But then there's also a legal level of attribution. And here, this is where the state then has to find if this malicious incident has violated any of its own national laws. And then, so that is the second level of attribution. And then they can decide then how that is handled. The third one, which is the one that makes the news that everyone knows about with the joint statements or the unilateral attribution, that's a political decision, and states have agreed that that is a political decision because it's possible to have at the level of technical and legal sufficient information that proves that you, Leonard, as country B, carried out a malicious incident. But it doesn't have to be public. We, as states, we have ways of engaging through note verbals, through our embassies. We can handle it on that level, and no one ever has to know. So no one ever has to be involved in it. The political decision to make it public is one that states make considering a variety of issues. And again, the aim is to deter malicious activity rather than to escalate. And I think that is the spirit in which at least the states during the UN negotiations have said that they've considered when doing those public attributions. But a lot more is done in private than what actually makes it to the public forums. But again, it is a very difficult process. States have gone back and forth around whether it's possible to share the evidence of a victim state to the state that they're accusing of an incident. And unfortunately, according to international law, there is no such obligation. And so those are some of the things that become very challenging with those kind of public attributions.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So not everything that states, of course, discuss, will become public, and like probably also for good reasons. A bit tied to that, actually, another user asked whether you can explain if there's like, or what is the best or most efficient framework for minimizing cyber threats. So is there like, a specific framework that is particularly effective? Is there, and how does that work?
As from our side, we think it's, I don't know if we can still talk about preventing threats anymore. The way in which we now approach it when we work with states is that the risks are there, the threats are there. It's just how now we manage those threats and how we mitigate those threats. Different cybersecurity protocols call for how to manage them, and we think that's the direction in which things are going with emerging tech now. There really is, I don't think, any one way in which we can really say we are preventing. But really we're focusing now on helping states manage and mitigate. And by managing them so that they still have continuity to be able to provide those important public services. But also then to mitigate the impact on not just our populations, but also to other countries. What we found in the last 5 years of the UN negotiations was a growing appreciation that these cyber incidents are not contained to the country in which the incident manifests, but rather that they are increasingly more and more cascading impacts. And so the focus then is to manage that cascading, because then it affects the critical infrastructure of other countries that may or may not be part of whatever is happening. And so I think the framework that we have is just then to try to minimize the impact and the severity of those malicious ICT incidents, and not really trying to prevent them at this stage, because I don't think we can really put the rabbit back in the hat, if that's the saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another user was asking, probably taking the focus a bit away from the state level, more to the individual level. Is there something that your organization can do to make also individuals more safe? So someone brought up cases of scamming through calls or SMS or through social media. Is there something that Uniteer is doing to assist individuals, either through capacity building or any other means?
I wouldn't say precise yes, because we are focused on supporting states, but we do have a couple of capacity building that have been targeted at individuals, but then even that has gone through nomination through government departments. So if you go through our website on SecTech, you'll see that we had a fellowship on international law, but we also had a Women in AI fellowship, and we also working on supporting the Women in ICTs fellowship. But then those nominations of who becomes part of the fellowship have been done through government. So that's the primary way in which we can perhaps touch on the individual, but everything is centered and goes through the respective governments.
Okay, then I'm briefly looking through the chat here. I have a bit of trouble to interpret the one question, but the question is there probably some a resource of investigations and other details surrounding state level incidents probably that users could consult to understand?
We don't have one, but I know of some that have a repository of ongoing and past incidents. I will find it and I will share it. I've got the name of the organization, but it's not coming. But there are organizations that already do that kind of work to then track specific incidents, where they are coming from and which state was the target. But so far, I know that would be the only information that they would have, because the investigations of those incidents are usually very diplomatic and highly politically sensitive issues. And so I don't think there is a resource that shares that, but definitely shares the public facing information about the specific incident. It's one of those tricky things when it's states involved, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, that we don't get to really see what happens behind the scenes, but then end up with a simple statement that then would say there was an incident, it was averted, but it's definitely become a serious issue. I think we all know of the incident against Costa Rica that led to a state of emergency, and everything else that ensued around that. That's probably some of the more publicly available that really shows exactly what happened And there've been a couple of informational sessions and webinars on what happened and how the state addressed that particular issue. But we don't currently keep that kind of information or track the incidents specifically. But again, if people are really interested in this kind of work, I'd also refer them to the UN Web TV, and I'll also share this, where they can then listen to the negotiations and how states engaged on these issues. In some sessions, you would have a state mention a specific incident during that meeting, and then share whether they have publicly attributed that to another state. And what that actually entailed, or what they are planning on doing. Even in the confines of the UN, those meetings were publicly available, and in the course of negotiations, states were sharing their own experiences, not necessarily to start a discussion around that one incident, but rather to make the point that as we were discussing norms of responsible state behavior and states adhering to international law, that there were incidents that were not of states behaving in ways that were not taking into consideration the norms. And you'll see I'm moving away from saying I'm obligated or having to comply, because again, these are voluntary, non-binding norms of responsible state behavior. And so states are encouraged to adhere, but there is no formal obligation or compliance that exists with them.
Okay. And the question was, are some countries more, or are you aware of that some countries are more targeted by certain, like attacks against their infrastructure than others? And also, are more citizens in certain countries more likely to be scammed than others? Are you aware of such differences?
Not scientifically. We're not. All we have again is what states have shared when they've seen an uptick of certain incidents. For instance, during the negotiations in 2021, a significant number of states were talking about ransomware incidents and how that was affecting their different sectors, from health right down to the financial sectors. And so that was a big one during that year. And we got the sense then that a significant amount of states was experiencing that. But then I'll also take you guys back to also during COVID, when a lot of states were reporting targeted incidents towards the health infrastructure, including their pharmaceuticals and their R&D medical centers. And so it's changed over the years. So we had ransomware, there was a big uptick with that. In the past few years, we've had AI-generated malware, and that's also been against critical infrastructure. And then we've also had a lot of supply chain related issues that have also made it into the headlines, and a lot of states impacted there. But we've also seen an uptick in states sharing other things, including against satellite infrastructure, against undersea cables infrastructure. And so it's from where we sit, because we've had to take what states are sharing. There have been different upticks at different times, depending on what states wanted to share. And so those are some of the patterns that we've seen, but nothing really solid or scientific that we could say was towards a specific type of demographic, no.
Okay, thank you. Due to the time, I think maybe like just one last question. I think that might be relevant for our students. Do you have any advice, probably for someone that would like to work in this area that you spoke about before, that you can give advice on how to start and where to look out for?
So this cybersecurity in the context of international peace and security. Long name, is primarily work done by ministries of foreign affairs, but we've also seen increasingly national cybersecurity agencies, but also computer emergency response teams. So what we have in the UN negotiations is that there were states, yes, represented by either national cybersecurity agencies, which I'm sure all of you can get into, but also representatives from the legal offices, because just of the nature of the work. But we had non-state stakeholders also participating in these discussions. And so we had civil society representing youth, civil society representing gender issues, but we also had organizations such as FIRST participating there, and as well as other organizations, think tanks that are doing research into this. So there are different ways of getting involved, and there is no minimum, I'd say, qualification or anything rather than your interest. You could be a lawyer coming into this. You could be a vulnerabilities researcher coming into this. You could be a white hat, a black hat coming into this. I think the main interest is, are you interested in the kind of cyber discussions that states are having within the UN, where you also know that you won't always have all the information, or maybe the more exciting stuff that you might have working with just private entities. But I'd say just to look out for think tanks or organizations that say they engage with the UN on norms of responsible state behavior, as well as conferences and research into this particular area. Communiques, including G20, always has a paragraph or a line on multilateral responsible state behavior. BRICS has a line on responsible state behavior, and I'm saying this because it's India, Netherlands. So there are also the smaller trilateral and plurilateral organizations that also have these lines that talk on international cyber policy.
Okay. Thank you so much for for this insight. I'm sure that our students really appreciated your talk, your insights that you have whilst working on UNIDIR, and I see also that people were commenting that they're very interesting what you said. So thank you for being with us here. Sally, I think due to the time that run up, I think we conclude today's lecture here. Thank you so much, Gihi, for your time. Exactly, and for the students, we will see each other again in half an hour approximately.
Thank you so much. I will share some of the resources, and then you can share. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening and for engaging, and have a wonderful continuation of the program. Bye-bye.